My name is Jonathan Silver. I'm the Warren R. Stern Senior Fellow at Tikvah and the editor of our magazine of Jewish ideas, Mosaic. This is a discussion for members of the wider Tikvah community, parents, grandparents, readers, subscribers, and most of all, students. Our point of departure will be last night's shameless, impudent, and wicked murder of Yaron Lischinsky and Sarah Milgrim, Hashem Yukom Damam. We all know that the day after Hamas forces infiltrated Israel by sea, land, and air with the express purpose of murdering the Jews of the Western Negev, the day after, European and American capitals hosted their first protests and demonstrations against the victims of the attack, not against its perpetrators. And many decent people called this out, not least among them our two distinguished guests this evening, Douglas Murray and Ruth Wisse. They warned darkly that this kind of genocidal rhetoric, we don't want two states, what we want is 48, Palestine should be free from the river to the sea, globalize the Intifada. They warned that this would have consequences, and here we are, the dark and inexorable consequences of that bloody thought made deed. The Intifada was in fact globalized last night on the streets of Washington, D.C. Now, Yaron, of course, was not Jewish. Yaron Lischinsky was a Christian, born in Nuremberg, of all the hauntingly symbolic places a man can be born. He emigrated to Israel, served in the IDF, and went on to serve his country in foreign service. Like millions and millions of other Christian Zionists, the fact that he was targeted for his devotion to Israel and thought to be a Jew, engaged to be married to Sarah Milgrim, who was in fact an American Jew, represents to me something of the great consequence of what last night is. In turning the gun on these two, the gunman, whose name I will not mention tonight, in fact revealed something about the great Western and civilizational dimensions of what this struggle is all about. Ladies and gentlemen, as for us, the Jews, it seems to me that last night we took an age of delusion, took a step out of focus, and the reversion to reality took another step into focus. Let's be honest. I don't think anyone should be surprised by this. The West has allowed annihilationist activists to run wild, and it has treated the killing of Jews as heroic. And so here you have an anti-hero who stepped up. What I'd like to do is turn to Douglas Murray on democracy, the author of On Democracies and Death Cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization, and Ruth Wisse, author of many books, but I think most poignantly tonight, the author of If I'm Not for Myself, The Liberal Betrayal of the Jews, and ask them to help us understand what this moment means. Ruth, I'd like to just come to you first and ask how you understood the news last night, and having written about this for so long, well before October 7th, how you understood it.
I think you've defined it, John, about as well as anyone could. And I think that everyone out there watching and listening understands it in pretty much the same way. I would like to start actually in a place which would never have occurred to me otherwise, and that is with Douglas Murray's being here. And also, by contrast, to differentiate the living from those who are no longer living, that Lischinsky, as you said, was a Christian. I'd like to start there because, you know, Douglas, I've heard him say this and I've read him. He doesn't like it when people say, what are you doing in this? How come you got involved in speaking so passionately about the Jews and defending Israel and writing on democracy and death cults and on the place of Israel in the defense of civilization? And he doesn't like to be asked that because for him, he has explained that the question is understood and it is obvious and it should be obvious to everyone. But it isn't obvious to everyone. And the reason I would start there, John, is because one of the things that I've always known, but it comes home more and more, is that Jews are a minority by choice. We are very different from the peoples that we are up against. We are not up there to colonize. We are definitely not out there to expand our territory or anything else. We are as essentially among the nations as other nations want to conquer other nations. This makes us very different, and it makes us a no-fail target. And what it means in our situation is that we must have the defense of others when we are under attack. Now, one of the things that we know is that only the worst enemies attack the Jews. You know that people, that a civilization, that a country, that a leader, the people are rotten if they organize their politics against the Jews. It goes without saying. It's always true. It's always true in history, right? So those people are always wrong, always evil, always seeking something. The least of it is the destruction of the Jews. The most of it is what the Jews represent to them and to others. So here we are representing something which we know is wonderful, the civilization that we carry, that we want to live in the image of God, that we want to make God proud of who we are and represent that in history and among our contemporaries. And then people attack us. And this particular attack that's been going on, since 1945, this is the most lopsided war in human history, the war against Israel and the war against the Jews. There's never been a war that outsized. So we cannot possibly fight it on our own. And just parenthetically, you see, this was the one thing that Zionism got wrong. It got everything right, but it thought that it could stop anti-Semitism because Jews would no longer be in the diaspora, they would be in their own country. Well, it turns out that it's even easier to attack Jews in their own country than it was to attack them in the diaspora. And you can attack them in both places at once, which means that it didn't solve the problem of anti-Semitism. It solved many problems for the Jewish people and made us much stronger and more wonderful and able to defend ourselves to some degree. But we still need others to understand how important it is for them to stand up against evil. And so when you see people like Douglas, who does it so magnificently, who does it, so well that one thinks, hey, I might as well hang up my task here. Let him do it for us. That's how good. It's not just that one is grateful. I think that it is very instructive for us that we have to begin understanding, not to be surprised by those who join us and speak for us, but we should begin to be surprised by those who don't. We really should understand that this is something that we can't demand of others, but we certainly have to expect it of others, and we have to articulate that expectation.
Douglas.
Well, first of all, thank you, John. Thank you very much to Ruth, and thank you everyone for joining us. Particularly thank you to Ruth for those very fulsome comments. I should say, I'm sure that there are many people on this call tonight who will have known in some way both the victims of last night's attack, and I know that you're all in our thoughts as well, in particular at this moment. I would just add two things to what Ruth just said. One is that there has clearly been, and I think all of us have felt it in recent weeks, and actually I'd say even in recent days, a boiling up of the usual lies that we've all put up with for the last 19 months, and indeed for many years before that, but particularly in the last period since October the 7th, there's been there was a visible boiling up of the lies, the defamations, the something must be done rhetoric. And that comes obviously from things like the UN report earlier this week, which was claiming that 14,000 Gazan babies were going to die in 48 hours unless the world acted. And then, of course, the report was withdrawn, but as everybody knows, the lie by that point had gone all around the world, and all of the media that splashed with that and all of the online accounts were running with it. Of course, they'd done their job, and it didn't matter if the report was retracted. But the sheer pressure that it seemed to me, I commented on it to a friend just a couple of days ago, the sheer pressure that seemed to be building up in recent days, and it was coming from the far right in America as well as from the far left, was his assertion that something must be done. That there's a podcaster who Donald Trump went on his podcast, Barron Trump's suggestion before the election, called Theo Von. He's a man of no brain, but he's got a significant following. And I noticed 2 days ago, for once, he did a piece to camera saying, you know, how can I be silent in the face of this genocide? And it seems, you know, there's a genocide going on. And he said, I'm not a geologist, but, which was a opportunity for a small laugh in dark times. He said, I'm not a geologist, but I believe there's a genocide going on. And can we allow this to happen? Surely we've got to stop it. That was coming from all sorts of sources, the obvious ones with huge platforms, and from every direction. The front page of the BBC for the whole of the last week has had stories 1, 2, and 3 about Gaza. And the rest of the world just drifts down the front page. And it seemed to me that all of this pushing of these lies, of these claims, were all boiling to this challenge that people were putting to each other of how can we allow this purported genocide to be happening and not do something? And the available something was revealed last night. And as you said in your opening remarks, Jonathan, the extraordinary thing about this is that, as many of us have said, that feels inevitable, at the same time as not taking any agency away from the killer. But it seems inevitable because of this drumbeat of the claims that were being made, added to the rhetoric which has been normalized in the period since October the 7th. And as I always say, actually from October the 7th. I've said many times in my column in the New York Post, and I've said again today for tomorrow, that, you know, all of these people who were saying to globalize the Intifada on campuses, some of them were totally ignorant. Some of them didn't know that their contemporaries, including American students, were murdered in a university campus in an Intifada by people who agreed with them about the advantages of Intifada. But all of this period of delegitimization, of demonization, of the pumping around of lies, was obviously at some point going to produce somebody or some people who thought, fine, I will act. And, you know, one of the things that's been startling about the coverage today, as well as some of it being very dignified and appropriate, one of the startling things about it is, of course, the reporting of the fact that the victims worked at the Israeli embassy, as if this was a targeted attack against Israeli embassy officials. Now, of course, that wouldn't itself be surprising, because just in recent weeks, we've learned that 2 terror cells were arrested in the UK, sent by the Iranian government to carry out assassinations in Britain, including an attack on the Israeli embassy in London. So there was clearly a growing movement of this, and something was going to happen. But the fact that the newspapers and the media have said, where they have, that this was an attack on 2 Israeli embassy staff, it seems to me also diminishes the nature of the crime, because the gunman, the murderer, could not possibly have known that. He was hanging out at the Jewish Museum in order to target Jews. And that seems to me to be something which is an escalation of the rhetoric into action that so many people have been trying to encourage, and now they've got the fruit of their labor.
Ruth, I want to come to one of the dominant strands of your writing and thinking and teaching on the subject of anti-Semitism. Everybody in the world except for Ruth Wisse misunderstands, misdiagnoses this phenomenon, and I'd like you to explain it to us the right way. According to you, Ruth Wisse, anti-Semitism is not primarily about the Jews. Anti-Semitism is about the anti-Semite. And I'd like you to just, in light of what we are now trying to understand, explain how you diagnose this larger phenomenon. The problem, Ruth, is that it reveals something very worrying about America.
Yes. Well, I think that Douglas has, laid out what our contemporary problem is. Let me just say that working to understand, as you want me to try to do this in this context, is all very well and good. But the most discouraging thing about my work in trying to understand, even when I think that I've understood it properly, even one can explain it in a way that you think it makes itself evident, to be able to understand is not being able to fix anything. It is not being able to correct the problem. So in other words, sometimes you can diagnose a problem only to discover that the diagnosis tells you that it's insoluble. And I think that one of the reasons that people don't want to understand the reality of anti-Semitism is it's because its enormity is sometimes so frightening to people that they would rather live without the understanding of it, because they know that, yes, I see what it is, I see how it happens, I see why it happens, and what good does it do me? So that, I would say, is a preface to these remarks, but you're perfectly right, and I'm grateful to you, of course. I think that anti-Semitism is the organization of politics against the Jews. And in a sense, it has nothing to do with the Jews. It is the organization of politics against them. So what we have to understand is, cui bono? Whom does this benefit? Why do they do it? People can say everybody hates the Jews. Well, I beg to differ. Not everyone has organized their politics against the Jews. I could say that there are many, let me put it this way, that not all anti-liberal leaders and polities and movements have been anti-Semitic. But there have not been any anti-Semitic movements and leaders and polities that have not been anti-liberal. So there is some affinity here between being against democracy, being against liberalism, being against what the Jews represent, which is, I would say in this context, primarily coexistence. So to bring it home, my worry has been for the longest time that the Arabs, the Pan-Arab League, and the Islamists have good reason, from their point of view, to have organized their politics against Jews. And what we have to understand is what it does for them. What do they gain from it? And when you think of it, it's really, you wonder how they can do without it. The Arab League formed in 1945, just when Hitler had been defeated. The Arabs have never been in a better position. Look, the Western countries were exhausted. They could have done anything. They could have begun their reforms. They could have moved in any number of directions. But the only thing that brought the Arab League together, the Arab League was formed around one thing alone, and that is we unite to destroy or to prevent the state of Israel from being, and then to destroy it. So you saw what a consolidating thing that is. And now, particularly with Islamism, Pan-Arabism is not necessarily the same as Islamism. You have many tribes, so you have this function of organization is one of the great functions that this plays in the Arab world. So look at the way it works. You can have Egypt being expelled because Sadat comes to Israel to make peace with it. Oh, we expel you from the Arab League. But then magically, if you need it back, well, we reform again. It is the consolidating element. It is also a coalition builder with the communist world, with the non-aligned world. And it has so many functions of that kind. The worry of it is at the moment, let's bring it home. Qatar does not want entirely to reform. I don't think it wants to become a democracy. And you see that now we are in a position, the United States has decided, well, we don't want to export democracy anymore. We'll take you as you are. All we want is for you to live within the democratic context. That is to say, live within the context of coexistence. Now, will it? Can it? So how brilliantly it is now positioned. It has the patina of being kind of pro-Western enough to court the United States and to want to court, and maybe some of its people will dress in a Western style, and maybe the new leader of Syria will dress in a Western style. We will play this particular game. In the meantime, though, it is those countries that have ginned up this war against the Jews that Douglas describes in its latest peroration. They're the ones who run Al Jazeera. They're the ones who are sending the students here to our universities to foment anti-Israel propaganda. Why? Well, look at the functions. One other function is if anti-Semitism is the politics of the pointing finger. Now, what does the pointing finger do? It says, Israel is at fault. Israel is at fault. Now, I'm sorry, you don't have to even say any more than that. You don't have to prove anything. You just have to keep making Israel the subject, not Sudan, not Yemen, not Egypt, not Qatar, not Saudi Arabia, nothing. You see, we don't speak about those countries. We speak about Israel. And so I think that it is very important for Jews particularly to understand that it is not about them. Unless we are able to turn the tables and to make people understand how evil they are to try to deflect attention from their own shortcomings by blaming the Jews, what they do to their own people in not reforming themselves, unless we are able to say, Palestine is Jordan. Jordan is most of Palestine. You have to solve your problems. Unless we can begin to say how wicked anti-Jewish politics is, not just because of what it does to the Jews, but because of how it corrupts democracies, and particularly how it deflects attention from all that is going wrong in their own midst. Unless we are able to do that, talk about them, focus on their shortcomings. And shorthand for that is never agree to be the defendant. If you step into the defendant's box, you're the defendant. So it's all very well and good to say, but Israel is so wonderful, but Israel is so great, but we don't do that, but we don't do this, but you know that's a lie. And try to make the crooked straight. Of course we have to do that to some extent, but that isn't enough at all. We have to be able to show others why it is so evil to join those forces against the Jews.
It sounds like, to reflect this back to you, Ruth, that the politics of the pointed finger is a politics which allows societies to reject responsibility for their own self-government, is a politics of blame and grievance. And as the function of anti-Semitism, the way that you elucidate it, serves as a coalition building feature, it allows groups that otherwise would have nothing to do with one another to serve one another in a politically active way. I'm afraid that your illustrations of that throughout the Arab world find an echo, a parallel in the Western world. Douglas, you wrote in 2017, The Strange Death of Europe, in which you spent a good deal of time in that book in exposition of the role that anti-Semitism was playing in the streets of Paris and the streets of London. And one cannot help but wonder if one is beginning to witness something like the strange death of America.
I think that's to overstate it at the moment, but I would just start answering that by saying that the sheer, just going back to a point I made before, which is that the sheer boiling point that seems to be emerging everywhere is it's not just in America, it's very much in Europe, of course. And I just mentioned in passing, I was speaking at an event for a Dutch organization last Sunday, which is the main Dutch monitoring center for anti-Semitic crimes, and which really is the best defense institute called CD in Amsterdam. And I was speaking, there was an Israeli speaker, Ayan Hersiali was speaking, and the building we were speaking at in the center of Amsterdam was defaced by red spray paint early in the day. Somebody threw a smoke canister through the windows. There were people arrested. There was a crowd chanting all the usual free Palestine from early in the morning. And once again, you see, as Ruth describes, I mean, this in a city which has plenty of problems, including having had a Jew hunt in the streets of the city just last November. In the midst of all this, it is, as Ruth said, it's so easy everywhere in the world for these people not to look at their own failings, not to look at what is wrong in their societies, but to stand outside a hall on a Sunday and scream about the Jews. And from Amsterdam to Washington, D.C., this has been the tenor of, particularly, as I say, the period since October the 7th. I think there are early warning signs of which we've remained almost incapable of rising to the challenge of. The most obvious one is the one that has been thrown up very visibly. I don't really like to linger on the campus issue because most people don't go to Ivy League universities anymore, thank goodness. And so it always sounds like a rarefied point to make to say it, but just consider the way in which most of the Ivy League universities in the last 2 years have permitted violence and intimidation as the norm, and pretended that figures like those at Columbia University are free speech martyrs, when in no other situation would they have got away with this if they'd have done this against any other minority. And, people say, well, the limits of free speech and so on. Nobody has yet been able to persuade me that if for the last 2 years there had been people from abroad coming into America using their time on student visas to call for the lynching of Black Americans, nobody can tell me that from right to left, or from the universities to people in politics, nobody can persuade me that this would have been a mere free speech issue. It would not have been. People would have said from the get-go, I would have thought no more than 24 hours, whether I think under a Democrat or a Republican government, they would have said, no, we have no need in our society for importing of racists calling for racist violence. And yet, in the case of the Jews, yes, that's been permitted, and more than permitted, encouraged. Ruth quite rightly brings up the case of Qatar. And I would say, and I say this in my New York Post column tomorrow, because I'm deeply worried about the blind spot that exists in DC about Qatar. One of the main, those of you who follow Memories dispatches will have got this earlier. One of the main Qatari government dailies wrote today on the pages of their newspaper in Qatar, where would the Zionists be if there were a few more people like last night's assassin in Arab countries that maintain ties with Israel? So there is a Qatari paper using its government-run privileges to say, why don't we get the assassins out across the rest of the Arab world, across the countries that are normalizing relations with Israel? It's astonishing to me that these blind spots can still exist. But as I said the other day in Amsterdam, and I say all the time wherever I am, there is always this follow-on fear in my Jewish friends whenever something like this happens, which is this fear of, is this country not safe for us either? Is this not a good place to be either? And obviously, there are a lot of things to say about this, and everyone's got their own attitudes towards it. But I really would just say now, as I have said for many years in many different countries, it's always the wrong way round that question. It should never be, is our country a country that is safe for Jews? It is, how can we make sure that our country is not a safe country for the people who would make it unsafe for Jews? And that is the way round that the question needs to be asked, because whether it's in Germany or America, I don't think there's any country in the world, or the Netherlands, I think there's no country in the world that should seek the importing of more anti-Semites and the encouragement of more anti-Semitism. And until we realize how much of this has been done deliberately against our societies, and I'd just add one other thing, a point I've tried to make very often in recent years, but takes on a certain piquancy today, has been the point, as Ruth has said many times, that of course it's the anti-Semitism issue is the first sign of all of these other issues boiling up, all the other rats coming out of the sewers and causing the other plagues in the society. If you look at the social media accounts of the killer from last night and of Yaron, you will see that on Yaron's Twitter, as well as him spending his last afternoon trying to fight back online against the lies pumped out by the UN against Israel, he had recently said in a post how proud he was of America, how much he loved America and loved being here in America. And compare that to one of the most recent social media posts of his killer, whose eloquent testimony to this country was death to America, with America spelt with the KKK in the middle. These are two totally different worldviews as well as two totally different people. And we should encourage, honor, and laud the first, and use every piece of social opprobrium against the second.
I want to just draw out something very important that Douglas has just said for our listeners. You see, it is not the Jews whom Douglas is primarily worried about with the importation of anti-Semites. It is the society that imports them. And you see how dark and rotten and horrible those societies become when they embrace this politics of avoiding responsibility.
If I may say one other thing quickly on that, Jonathan, it's important to stress, because I think this will come up in the coming days, is that it seems that the killer last night had he was not of a Muslim background, he was not a radical jihadist or anything like this. What we have seen is one of the first, not the very first, but one of the first examples of this radical left anti-Israelism, anti-Westernism producing some of its first foot soldiers. People talk about the radicalization of the jihadists and of far right-wing extremists and so on, but this is a form of radicalization. To have been in America in recent years, to have been on social media, to have been at various American institutions like the University of Chicago, which this young man seems to have been at, is to have been radicalized.
Illinois. I think the University of Illinois.
Illinois.
Yes.
Right.
Please, sorry.
No, but this is a radicalization process, obviously.
Yes.
We have many questions that are coming in. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A function in the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll try to get to as many as we can. I have one final question, which Ruth is prompted to mind by one of your remarks, which is it's all well and good to think the right things. In fact, that's indispensable. But we are embodied creatures who are called also to live in the world, and we have to do the right things too. So the question that I would have is if there's something that we can learn, Ruth, from that Zionist ambivalence that you spoke about before. Of course, there were idealistic Zionists who thought that the establishment of sovereignty in the land of our ancestors would solve the problem of anti-Semitism. But there were also hard-headed Zionists who believed that the sovereignty in the land of Israel would finally allow the Jews who, when attacked, as Jews inevitably will be attacked, to have in their hands the weapons to fight back. And the question that I think we have to ask is, are we now hearing a summons into history where we too need to have in our hands the tools that we need to fight back? And what you would counsel Jews in America and their many thousands and millions of friends to do?
Well, I would say amen to everything that Douglas said, especially in ending his remarks. It is about America. And the question really is whether America can stand up for itself, which is why when I was at Harvard, I began to be concerned, first and foremost, about the fact that it kept ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, off campus for 40 years. This was long before the anti-Semitism phenomenon began to gin up at Harvard, but it was already anti-American in a very specific way. And John, where you put your finger on it is if a country is not determined to defend itself, if it does not think in terms of defending itself against the enemies that it's obviously going to have and already has, then you're lost. And if particularly the best and the brightest are not the ones who are encouraged to do everything for their country, then, what happens is that you get this politics of grievance and blame that then looks for its object and finds it in the Jews, but it's the grievance and blame that begins first. And that is really what you saw in America. I was very distressed recently. A very wonderful colleague, in a way, in the field of Jewish studies, has written a book which I have not yet read, but the title is Anti-Semitism, an American Tradition. I found that shocking. This is entirely upside down. It is anti-Semitism is an anti-American tradition. It has not been an American tradition. It's the same way of saying that this country was founded on slavery, instead of saying that this is a country that managed to defeat slavery and to try to transcend slavery and to try to make up for the fact that it once had a slave culture. So I think that our task here is, is a doubled loyalty, if you wish. I never could understand this concept of dual loyalty. Are you a loyal citizen to this or are you a loyal citizen to that? It becomes a conflict when the two countries or the two things that you stand for are in conflict. But in the case of Israel and America, which share the same basic values and in fact stem from very much the same traditions, it's really a doubled loyalty. The people who feel most loyal to America should be those who feel most protective of Israel, which is the greatest ally that America has, certainly in the Middle East and possibly in the entire world, a functional ally that gives it information, that gives it a higher quality of protection in its own way, right? So I do think that the main thing is to really accentuate all that is good. The universities began to fail when they lost confidence in their own being, in their own project. And now, my colleagues at Harvard, I follow these threads very, very carefully. You have no idea how much anguish there is now. What can we do? What can we do? What can we do? Dozens and dozens of very good people really committed to this. Do you know what they think they can do? Do you know what they talk about? They talk about having constructive debates heterodoxy. Oh, if only we had more heterodoxy on time. They don't understand that the failure is that no one has been teaching them about America, why it is an exceptional country, what has made it that. In other words, there has been no reinforcement of what is most necessary. And you know, this is something that built the Jewish people. It knows from generation to generation, you have to teach the basics. You have to teach the greatness. You have to teach the values. You have to inculcate them both emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually at every level, right? And it is so, and in a sense, it's America's failure to have done that on its own behalf that opened the door for this horrible, anti-Semitic, for people to come in with even worse ideas than those that were really, growing within America itself, right? So in addition to the, anti-capitalism and the, feminist, ideology against men, and all the grievance movements that you had, that Black Lives Matter, but white lives are there because whites are supremacists and so on. All these ideas then come in, people from the Middle East and say, oh, what's really bad is this country, Israel is really
the sum and substance of all of that grievance.
The sum and substance of the grievance, you see.
Yes.
But so I think back to the basics, if it isn't too late, and I really do not think, in that sense, I am not a wild-eyed optimist, but I do believe that America is still capable of resisting even the worst trends that are emerging within itself.
I'll just say on our own behalf, Ruth, you know this well. Douglas, you may know too, that this year Tikvah began our new school, a new brick and mortar school, Emet Academy, the first Jewish classical school in the country. Their students are not only studying Latin and Hebrew, but self-defense and martial arts. Not because, God forbid, we wish to lionize violence for the sake of violence, but because we think that a self-commanding people and a well-educated person formed in mind, body, and soul is going to be able to protect themselves. And I think we have to take that seriously. That is a new Jewish imperative that we ought to remember. There are, as I say, so many questions. I'm going to read the first one here. It's clear that Holocaust education has been a failure. It's clear that false narratives about Israel, the Middle East conflict, and Jews in general have taken a hold amongst younger generations. What can we do? Traditional American Jewish organizations have failed us. How can we stop playing defense all the time? Ruth, you've been on the Holocaust education beat. This is one of your themes.
Yes, unfortunately it is. I was against Holocaust education in 1970s when in my community of Montreal, they began to talk about putting up a Holocaust museum. And my reason for it was quite simple, that we Jews are specialists in keeping our dead alive. We mourn them. We carry them with us. We will never forget them. And I don't think that the Jewish people is in danger of ever forgetting those who were killed in the Shoah and even holding on to the culture that they created. But that is not who we are. We performed this most remarkable thing. I don't know, Douglas, you tell me if there's anything like it in history. 3 years after 1/3 of this people was crushed in not just the worst catastrophe, but the most humiliating murder of 1/3 of its people. 3 years later, you have the resurrection of the Jewish people in the land of Israel that had been under foreign occupation for 2,000 years. Where in human history do you have anything like that? So my feeling was, if you were going to come with a story to the world, to Canada, to America, put it out there in the mall If you wanted to come to tell people about yourself, for God's sake, tell them this story of the most remarkable story of self-confidence, of resilience, of rising from the dead, however you want to say it. Doesn't have to be romanticized. The grittier you get with the information, the more remarkable it becomes, right? So instead of talking about the rise of Israel, this infrastructure that had been built before the destruction, all of it, the history of Zionism, the marvels of it. Instead of talking about that, we emphasized, the success of anti-Semitism in Europe and the failure of Jewish political strategy, right? So it was the wrong education. And to answer the question, the way you correct it is by trying to now retool.
Yes, I would just add one thing to that, if I may. I think Dara Horn's recent work on the failure of trying to tackle anti-Semitism by Holocaust education museums across America is very pertinent. And I've often said to friends that the single most effective Holocaust museum in the world is Yad Vashem, not just because of what is in it, but what happens at the end. That you come through the valley of death and you're in the land of Israel, and that therefore there's a. But the other way I would add to what Ruth just said is something which I always say to audiences wherever I am in the world, which is to just remember. And again, it comes to that thing of teaching and educating people about the good stuff. Educating people from the first Zionist Congress in 1899 to the victory in 1973 could all happen in one human lifespan. Now, Herzl himself was not alive to see it, but you could have been at the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1899 and have continued to live not just to see the creation of the state, but the fighting of the state for its survival and its winning. And this is, as Ruth says, I can't think of another case in history where such a miracle was accomplished in a single human lifespan. And these are the good things that need to be remembered and held on to. And I'd just add one other thing to that, which is it's a profoundly disturbing to me that the experience of European Jewry in the 20th century should forever be used as some kind of wider learning moment for other groups to then put their own experiences on. And if anyone goes to the tremendous Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., you are not asked in the last room, who are the Black Americans of today? Who are the equivalent people of what enslaved Americans were in the early 19th century? You're not asked to extrapolate out the Black American experience for the benefit and moral improvement of other groups. It is simply something which is there on its own, and you learn about it and you leave. But this persistent desire to use the Shoah in this way has now rebounded, as we see in the war in Gaza. And now it is used against the Jews. And every single lie and libel is deliberately used in a way that echoes what happened in the 40s, so that Israel must be accused of genocide. It must be accused of running concentration camps. It must be accused of putting up a Warsaw ghetto, and so on. All of these things done deliberately in order to further wound Jews. And Jews and friends of Jews must, in the face of that, say, we know exactly what you're doing, and we will not put up with it, and we will not tolerate it.
Douglas, this is a question about the gradual, as your friend and my teacher, Jonathan Sachs, the late Jonathan Sachs, like to describe the moral climate change which our societies are now suffering under. To what extent did the blatant murder of the United Healthcare executive Brian Thompson contribute to this outrageous crime, especially when considering the celebrity achieved by his assailant?
Well, the killer yesterday, it seems, was an admirer of Mangione, the murderer of the healthcare executive. This is a very disturbing trend which has taken hold on the radical left in America, which is that there is desirable political violence, and very many people, including prominent people like Elizabeth Warren, said in the wake of that, she said, well, people can only be pushed so far. And this is a legitimization of violence. Um, there is no, however difficult the American healthcare system may be, there is no but after the condemnation of people appointing themselves the rightful assassins of a healthcare executive. So this is all part of the same slide, which again has nothing to do with the Jews. It's a slide into inhumanity and legitimation of violence, indeed the extolling of violence, which is one of the reasons why these people find so much kinship with Hamas. The endless mistake of thinking that there can never be enough blood spilt so long as it's other people's blood.
Here's a question for both of you. Ruth, you'll take this first, but in the coming decades, where do you predict the greater increase in anti-Semitism will come from? The progressive left or the reactionary right? And whatever you think, why do you think that?
Choice of poisons, I guess. Well, I must say that I think that the threat from the right is of a certain kind, but you have to understand, and I think that that this is very basic, that if you want to portray villainy in the United States of America to this day, you portray it in fascist form. That's the only really safe form of villainy. So that's kind of understood. This country went to war against the fascists. It went to war against that kind of anti-Semitism, that kind of power. We will crush you. We will drive you into the sea. And that cannot be popular. As far as I can tell, it has a certain limit of popularity. And I don't think that it can rise again. And I don't know what will be the driving force of it. But I think, in a sense, the Arab world, again, the drivers of this anti-Semitism that we see has it both ways. In one sense, they say, we will drive you into the sea. You will never be able to win against us because we have the greater numbers. And besides, we like war. We are a warlike people. We believe in it. And we know that you don't. And so that side is there. I think that one is much more vulnerable here in America, John, and to the questioner, much more vulnerable on the other side. It's the penetration of anti-Semitism into America could not have happened unless the inversion had happened first. In other words, the inversion, the big lie. Those who are trying to destroy Israel say the Jews are trying to destroy the Palestinians. They, who have 640 times more land than the Jews, say, oh, the Jews are trying to displace the Palestinians. In other words, you turn it around so that you make Israel the villain, and therefore the Palestinians are the poor victims, not victims of their fellow Arabs, which indeed they are, but victims supposedly of the Jews. So it's only through the left that ideologically this has entered into America. It now is being picked up by, yes, discrimination and people on the right and Me Tooers on the right who want to, get into the picture, and they see that there's something to be gained now on, you get popularity apparently by going out there with those jokes and with those statements. But ideologically, I don't think that America is as susceptible to power as it is to pity. And that is why I think that that's where it will enter. And that has been the stronger side. Let me also say that I find it very funny when Jews say to one another, that the defense of Israel should be a bipartisan issue. And what they mean by that is that Jews should vote for both sides. or should be bipartisan. That's not what a bipartisan issue means. Bipartisan issue means that both those parties should be for Israel. And that is one of the things that we have to work to ensure. You cannot have a party in America which defines itself as anti-Israel, even in part. That is intolerable. It's intolerable for the Democratic Party to permit such a thing in its midst. And if that should be happening within the Republican Party as a party, then I think that that would be a great stain on that part of the country. And I think it is being resisted and hopefully will continue to be.
Douglas?
I'm happy to take another question. I concur with everything Ruth was.
Okay, good. I do think also, Ruth, that the right has antibodies that it can draw from its cultural elements, and in particular, the philo-Semitic Christian elements that find themselves at home on the right, which are not as present on the left. But yes, there are many questions. How can we? Here's a question. How can we respond with empathy and without contempt or sanctimony to friends and loved ones who have internalized the anti-Zionist narrative?
Douglas?
It depends how deep in they are. At some level, disdain is exactly what is required, and indeed contempt. On the other hand, I do believe that people can be argued out of positions. One of my favorite quotes is from the great Irish satirist Jonathan Swift, who said, "You cannot reason a man out of a position he was not reasoned into." And that is always worth bearing in mind, that if somebody has got to their misunderstanding through reason, then they can be reasoned out of it. But I think that when you're in the realms of anti-reason, when you're in the realm of emotion, of identity, effectively, which, to go back to this, is clearly going to be a very important issue in this case, is people affixing a form of identity around Palestinianist, Arabist, jihadist anti-Semitism. If that's your identity, and you're wearing your kafir and your terrorist chic, despite never having been even to the continent in which this is all being litigated on the ground, then it's extremely hard. It's like hurting somebody's ego. Nevertheless, I think it should be and always can be attempted. But it has to be done piece by piece and over time, because that was how people were misinformed into this in the first place. Was steady by steady drip of lies, so that the genocide claim has been going on since 2005, when Israel withdrew from Gaza. And we could all point out it's an odd genocide where a population doubles in the area in question during the alleged genocide, but we could point this out and reasoning people might listen. But the genocide claim followed the apartheid claim, followed by, it's been so many layers of every possible accusation against the state of Israel, that by now it has become as I've said in my recent book, it's the projection mechanism for everyone's discontents. If you're unhappy with your life, you can believe that you've got to campaign to free Palestine, because then everyone will be free. A catastrophic misjudgment, but yes, people can be argued out of it, but not everyone, not the ones who weren't argued into it.
Yes. Well, this is absolutely right. I mean, I think that the context in this case, those poor university presidents who said it was all about the context. In this case, I think that one may say that you're right. If you see before you someone who is reasonable and who is asking a question or holding a position out of reason, then it's worth reasoning with the person. And I made this distinction. I've been a teacher all my life. Well, of course, as a teacher, you have to have that attitude. Every opinion which is expressed in a classroom may not be as equal to every other, but you have to take every student for where the student is. That's your function as a teacher. You have to teach every student. You don't just teach whom you want to, you teach, and teaching involves making the better arguments, persuading. Those are the forms. However, I think that you've encountered this probably, Douglas, certainly as much as I have. When you are speaking, I don't do it all that much anymore, but when you're in a hostile environment and when you're facing people of the kind that you describe who have an idée fixe and whom you cannot obviously even hope to persuade, and certainly not in an argument that is in public, then perhaps other tactics are involved.
Yes.
And there, I once developed this tactic. Somebody asked me in a very hostile way, "You didn't say anything about apartheid, about Israel apartheid in your speech," at the end of my saying. And so I said, "And you didn't tell me why you killed your grandmother." And the guy was flabbergasted. And he said, "You didn't hear my question." I said, "I heard your question very well. You didn't hear my question. Why did you kill your grandmother?" And and then I looked at the whole audience. I said, "Why did he kill his grandmother? He's going to tell me that he didn't, but can he prove it? Where is she? Show me." You see? So I will not be put into that position of being asked a hostile question and then asked to answer it. Because if it is based on a stupid premise, and if it is a lie and it cannot be addressed reasonably, then don't think one should get into the pit, into the swamp of answering.
Could I just add one other thing to what Ruth said? Because a generative thought is that I think one thing that I've been very aware of in the last couple of years has been a deep fundamental difference, not just in culture and outlook and much more, but in means of communication. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the protesters who we've all had to face in the last couple of years in America, on campus and off, on the streets of New York, on the streets of Washington, D.C., many times in recent years, if you listen to what they're doing, what are they doing? They chant. They chant. And chanting is the opposite of thinking. We are used to the idea of exchanging ideas, learning from each other, distilling an idea to its essence, getting an argument to its best. But we are dealing with people who use communication and language not to persuade, but to browbeat and to intimidate. Nobody agrees with your chant because you've chanted it 20 times. Nobody says on the 19th time you chant the same thing, "Oh, I've got the point, now I agree with you." Because it's not meant to be used like that. This is the use of language as a truncheon mechanism. It is agree, know that we're powerful, know that we're thuggish, and we will not leave until we have kept beating you with our phrases. And this is a different way of using human language. And it tells everything about what these people are actually involved in. They're not involved in the exchange of ideas. They're not involved in the realm of thought or reason. They're involved in thuggish intimidation, sometimes using language, sometimes using violence.
It's almost to deploy language to quiet the mind, actually. Rather than to stimulate it. And we've gone a few minutes over. I want to end with the final question, which is a very Tikvah sort of question. Douglas, you have written the very wonderful On Democracies and Death Cults. We are hosting a reading group for college students and young professionals. About 100 of them are reading that book right now as we speak. Ruth, you have written dozens of books. I mentioned The Liberal Betrayal of the Jews. One could speak about Jews in Power and many others that you've written. I'd like to ask each of you to end our conversation this evening with a recommendation, something else that you think that speaks to the moment that you'd recommend to the parents, grandparents, students listening to our conversation that you think can summon up the moral courage that's needed to carry us in this moment?
Do you mean something to read?
Something to read.
Something to read. Well, I always fall back. I mean, reading is, I'm told, much more difficult for students and for people nowadays. I don't believe it really. But, John, no surprise to you that I would recommend, although I'm a professor of Yiddish literature and I love Jewish literature, I would recommend Daniel Deronda to anyone who can undertake it. I love that novel. I think that George Eliot has a mind like no other that I've encountered, with overwhelming sympathies, and the birth of the Zionist movement before there was a Zionist movement, a defense of liberalism, which would have to be a defense of the Jews and so on. But I would add now, since you give me the leave to do so, we had a Hebrew book translated, which I love very much. It is called The Gavriel Tirosh Affair, and it will appear within the next half year in a translation by Hillel Halkin into English. It's a Hebrew novel about Israel in the 1930s, about a high school group that has to be taught how to fight against its will, against enemies who cannot be defeated in any other way, that they have to go to war. This is such a book for this time. It's very countercultural. It is going to be, I guess, it's going to be very interesting to see how it is received. So it's called the Gavriel Tirosh Affair, and look for it in about 4 or 5 months.
So the Gabriel Tirosh Affair, upcoming soon, I think, from Koren,
That's right, from Koren.
translated by Hillel Halkin, and of course, for the even bolder among you, you can enter into the 800 pages of Daniel Deronda by the very wonderful George Eliot. Douglas, what would you recommend?
Oh gosh. Maybe I could finish on an optimistic but also difficult note. But it's some couple of years ago, Yuval Noah Harari was asked in an interview what book he would recommend for the future, and he said, given the amount of change that is going on in the world, there is no book that you could give your children to understand the world. And I was so enraged by this and said in multiple interviews and pieces afterwards, the obvious thing to understand the future is the same book that saw our peoples all through the past, which is Scripture. And if that's done and got us all Christian Jews here, then it'll get us to the next bit. But I just wanted also to say one other thing, because I was so moved by reading about the lives of the victims of last night, of Sarah and Yaron, and particularly thinking about him choosing to do service in the IDF. And I wanted to finish, if I may, on a point which I've been thinking about a lot. One of the great blessings of my life in recent years is acquiring a large number of rabbis, more than most of my Jewish friends. But I've learned so much speaking with them, and I was deeply, deeply moved a few weeks ago, sitting down for breakfast with a friend of mine, it's a rabbi in Boston. And he made an observation, which, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to just leave you with. It's pertinent, I think, to the moment, which is he mentioned to me that, and I'm going to horribly mangle the Hebrew, so please correct me, but the Hebrew word for Zionism is sionut. Am I right?
That's
Right.
right.
And there's another word that's close to it, siniut, cynicism. And the point that the rabbi made to me was, this is one of those moments where the language is telling us something. These two words, Zionism and cynicism, in the Hebrew are close in sound, but the trick is that they are opposites, that they are opposites. and that the cynic will approach life disbelieving, jaded, full of low opinion. And the Zionist cannot afford to be a cynic, and the Zionist builds. And that even at a time of mourning like this, even at a time of worry like this is something we should hold on to, is that the Zionist builds and will continue to do so in the face of the cynics and in the face of the considerable evil which we've had the misfortune to see in the last 24 hours.
Ruth Wisse, Douglas Murray, thank you so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we'll adjourn.